To comprehend the gravity of our current economic standing, one must first step back from the daily fluctuations of the stock market and observe the grand architecture of history. Most people view the global financial system as a permanent fixture, an immutable law of nature that has always existed and will always persist. However, history is not a straight line of constant stability. It is an intricate series of cycles. If we observe carefully, we realize that the concept of a world reserve currency, a single nation's money used globally for trade and savings, is a transient privilege, not a permanent right. Over the past 5 centuries, the crown of global financial dominance has passed from one nation to another, following a predictable and rhythmic pattern of ascension, peak, and eventual displacement. Every major global power has believed, at the height of its influence, that its currency was invincible. Yet, the Venetian ducat, the Dutch guilder, and the British pound all eventually succumb to the same fundamental forces of economic gravity. These cycles typically last between 80 to 110 years, and when we examine the timeline of the United States dollar, the parallels to past transitions become impossible to ignore. The cycle begins with ascension. A nation emerges from a period of conflict or innovation with a competitive advantage. It develops superior trade networks, military strength, or technological breakthroughs. Because of this strength, other nations begin to desire its currency, viewing it as a safe haven for value. This leads to the second phase, stability and dominance. During this period, which can last for decades, the currency becomes the bedrock of the global system. It facilitates international trade, prices essential commodities like oil or gold, and serves as the primary asset held by foreign central banks. This is the era of exorbitant privilege, where the issuing nation can borrow more cheaply than anyone else because the world has an insatiable demand for its debt. However, this very privilege often sows the seeds of the final phase, decline. Dominance leads to complacency. The nation begins to overextend itself, often through massive debt accumulation, overseas military commitments, or a decline in domestic productivity relative to emerging competitors. As the debt to GDP ratio climbs, the confidence that gives the paper money its value begins to erode. We are currently witnessing the United States in a position eerily similar to that of the British Empire at the dawn of the 20th century. In 1914, the British pound was the undisputed king of global finance. By the end of the 2 world wars, it had been unseated by the dollar. Today, the incentives of the global community are shifting. When you understand incentives, you understand the future of behavior. The rise of $33 trillion in national debt and the weaponization of the financial system have forced other nations to seek alternatives. We are not looking at a sudden collapse tomorrow, but rather a logical, historical progression toward a new monetary order. The year 2026 stands as a potential inflection point because the cracks in the dam, the growing debt, the rising interest payments, and the shift in geopolitical alliances are reaching a critical mass that history tells us cannot be sustained indefinitely. To understand why a monetary system fails, one must look beneath the surface of daily stock prices and into the structural integrity of the currency itself. Money, in its modern fiat form, possesses no intrinsic value. It is not backed by gold, silver, or any physical commodity. Instead, the value of the US dollar is derived entirely from collective confidence, a psychological and social contract between the issuing government and the global public. This confidence is supported by 3 fundamental pillars: fiscal discipline, political stability, and economic productivity. If you observe the current landscape carefully, you will see that for the first time in nearly a century, all 3 pillars are showing significant structural fractures. The first pillar, fiscal discipline, is perhaps the most visible area of concern. The American national debt has now surpassed the staggering milestone of $33 trillion. To the average citizen, a trillion is an abstraction. But in economic terms, the ratio of this debt to the nation's gross domestic product, GDP, is what truly matters. We have crossed the 120% debt to GDP threshold. Historically, when a nation's debt exceeds its annual economic output to this degree, it enters a debt trap where the cost of servicing that debt begins to cannibalize the economy. Currently, interest payments on this debt consume more than 15% of all federal tax revenues. As interest rates remain elevated to combat inflation, this percentage is projected to climb even higher. We are approaching a mathematical reality where the government must either drastically cut services, massively increase taxes, or, as is most common in history, print more money to inflate away the debt, thereby devaluing the currency in your pocket. The second pillar, political stability, is the invisible glue that holds a currency together. Investors hold dollars because they believe the United States is a predictable, rule of law nation with a functional government. However, we are currently witnessing a level of political polarization and domestic friction not seen since the mid-19th century. When a government becomes paralyzed by internal conflict, its ability to make the hard choices regarding spending, debt ceilings, and long-term fiscal reform vanishes. International observers and foreign central banks watch this dysfunction with growing unease. If the world begins to doubt the basic functionality of the American legislative process, the premium they are willing to pay for the dollar will evaporate. The third pillar is economic productivity and global demand. For decades, the US dollar has enjoyed an artificial demand because it is the primary currency for global trade, particularly for energy. This is the petrodollar system. However, this pillar is being actively undermined. Nations like China, Russia, India, and Brazil, the BRICS bloc, are aggressively developing alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar entirely. If the global demand for dollars decreases because nations no longer need them to buy oil or electronics, those trillions of excess dollars currently held overseas will begin to flow back to American shores. This surge in the domestic money supply, without a corresponding increase in real goods and services, creates a massive inflationary pressure that traditional central bank tools cannot easily fix. As we approach 2026, these three forces are converging. The water pressure behind the dam is at an all-time high. It is not a matter of if the structure will be tested, but rather how it will respond when the next global shock arrives. For the generation between 40 and 80 years old, understanding that these pillars are leaning is the first step toward true financial preparation. You cannot protect what you do not perceive to be at risk. History is a relentless teacher, yet its lessons are often ignored by those living through periods of apparent calm. To truly grasp the risk we face in 2026, we must move beyond the theoretical and examine the lived reality of those who stood where we stand today, trusting in a system that was silently fracturing. The most dangerous assumption one can make is that it can't happen here. History shows us that monetary instability is not a disease of broken nations alone. It is a mathematical consequence of fiscal overextension that has afflicted even the most sophisticated empires. Consider the tragic case of Argentina. In the late 1992, Argentina was not a backwater economy. It was a sophisticated nation with a thriving middle class. To project an image of absolute stability, the government pegged the Argentine peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar. For years, this created an illusion of immense wealth. Imagine a family in Buenos Aires in the year 2000, a couple in their late 52nds who had worked for 30 years accumulating 50,000 pesos in their savings account. Because of the peg, they viewed this as $50,000 USD, a secure nest egg for their looming retirement. However, the underlying fiscal reality was unsustainable. The government had borrowed too much to maintain the illusion. In December 2001, the dam finally broke. The government froze bank accounts and pesosified the economy, breaking the link to the dollar. Overnight, that $50,000 in purchasing power evaporated, losing 70% of its value almost instantly. These people did not lose their money because they were reckless investors. They lost it because they had 100% of their labor stored in a single failing monetary system. They mistook a temporary political promise for a permanent economic law. The experience of Turkey offers a more modern, gradual, but equally devastating example. Between 2013 and 2021, the Turkish lira lost more than 80% of its value. This wasn't a single overnight crash, but a slow-motion train wreck. For a Turkish family, the price of bread, fuel, and imported medicine didn't just rise, it soared beyond their reach. Those who kept their savings in lira saw their life's work turn to dust. Yet, those who had the foresight to diversify, holding even a small portion of their wealth in gold or harder foreign currencies, found themselves with a lifeboat that allowed them to navigate the storm while their neighbors drowned in devalued paper. Even the stable West is not immune. We must look at the British pound in 1967. At that time, London was still the undisputed financial capital of the world, and the pound was a symbol of global prestige. Yet, due to trade imbalances and high government spending, the Prime Minister was forced to announce a 14% devaluation of the pound in a single evening. The famous pound in your pocket speech attempted to reassure citizens that their money hadn't changed, but the reality was immediate. Everything imported became more expensive, and the real wealth of every British citizen was slashed. The common thread in these stories is the Minsky moment. This is the point where a long period of stability encourages excessive risk-taking and debt, which eventually leads to a sudden, catastrophic collapse in confidence. As we approach 2026, the global economy is showing signs of a looming Minsky moment. The unprecedented money printing of the pandemic era has created a hangover of excess liquidity that has not yet been fully accounted for. When confidence breaks, it doesn't happen linearly. It happens all at once. For the American saver, the lesson is clear. The strength of a currency is a reflection of the trust in the system, and trust is the most fragile commodity in the world. Most financial advisors preach a standard gospel of diversification, usually involving a mix of 60% stocks and 40% bonds. They tell you that this balance will protect you from market volatility. However, if you observe carefully, you will notice a glaring flaw in this logic. It is a strategy of diversification within a single monetary system. If your stocks are American, your bonds are U.S. Treasuries, and your cash is in a domestic bank, you are not truly diversified. You are 100% long on the U.S. dollar. You have bet your entire future on the continued stability of a single currency at a time when its fundamental pillars are shaking. This is what we call concentration risk. Imagine a farmer who grows 10 different varieties of corn. He might think he is diversified, but if a single blight specifically targets corn, his entire harvest is lost. To be truly safe, he needs to grow wheat, potatoes, and livestock. Similarly, for those between 40 and 80 years old, the blight we face is the accelerated devaluation of the currency in which all your assets are denominated. Even if your stock portfolio goes up in numerical terms, you could still be losing wealth if the value of the currency is falling faster than the market is rising. To understand the impact of this risk, we must look at how currency devaluation affects your daily life, even if you never leave your home state. We live in a hyper-globalized reality. Most Americans assume that if they don't travel to Europe or buy luxury imports, a weaker dollar won't hurt them. This is a dangerous misconception. The modern American lifestyle is built on a foundation of global inputs. Consider your basic expenses. Your electricity and heating bills are tied to the global price of oil and natural gas, which are traded on international markets. Your medications, many of which are manufactured in India or China, will skyrocket in price if the dollar's purchasing power drops. The food on your table depends on fertilizers and machinery components sourced globally. Even your insurance premiums and healthcare costs are sensitive to the global cost of medical technology. When the dollar loses 20% of its value relative to other assets, your cost of living doesn't just wiggle, it resets at a higher, more painful level. For someone approaching or already in retirement, this hidden tax is devastating. You no longer have decades of earning potential to make up for the loss. Your $500,000 or $1 million nest egg might stay the same on your bank statement, but its ability to buy a comfortable life is being hollowed out from the inside. This is why 2026 is a crucial inflection point. The lag between money printing and its effect on prices is ending. The extra money injected into the system over the last several years is finally meeting the reality of a world that is less willing to accept dollars as the only medium of exchange. The goal of preparation is to move from a dollar-centric mindset to a value-centric mindset. You must stop asking, how many dollars is this worth? And start asking, how much real value does this represent? Once you make this shift, the path to protecting your wealth becomes clear. It isn't about chasing high-risk returns. It's about exiting the path of a single currency trap before the exit door becomes too crowded. The objective of an intelligent investor in 2026 is not to predict the exact moment of a crash, but to build a portfolio that is anti-fragile, one that survives or even thrives, regardless of what happens to the US dollar. True protection requires multi-system diversification. This means owning assets that exist outside the traditional American banking system and the fiat currency loop. The first pillar of this strategy is physical commodities. For over 2,000 years, gold has been the ultimate money of last resort. It has no counterparty risk. It does not require a government's promise to be valuable. An allocation of 5% to 10% in physical gold and silver provides a hedge that historically moves in the opposite direction of a failing currency. When confidence in paper disappears, the world returns to the only assets that cannot be printed into oblivion. Second, we must look at international diversification. This involves holding a portion of your wealth in currencies or assets of nations with superior fiscal health countries like Switzerland or Singapore. By holding the Swiss franc or international equities, you are decoupling your future from the specific political and fiscal mistakes of Washington, D.C. If the dollar devalues by 20%, your international holdings effectively gain 20% in purchasing power, acting as a stabilizer for your total net worth. Third, prioritize real assets with intrinsic utility. This includes well-located real estate, productive agricultural land, or shares in essential companies, businesses that produce food, energy, and medicine. Regardless of which currency is dominant, people will always need to eat, heat their homes, and treat illnesses. These assets have a natural inflation adjustment built into them. As the currency weakens, the nominal price of these essentials simply rises to meet the new reality. Finally, we must acknowledge the role of digital scarcity. While highly volatile, established cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin represent a new value system that is mathematically capped. Unlike a central bank that can print trillions at the push of a button, Bitcoin's supply is fixed. For a modern investor, a small 2% to 5% allocation serves as a high upside insurance policy against a total systemic reset. The transition to this protected state should not be a frantic leap, but a disciplined migration over 12 to 18 months. This gradual approach allows you to build positions without being exposed to short-term market timing risks. Conclusion: the choice is yours. History teaches us that periods of great change always catch the complacent by surprise, but they reward the prepared. The forces we have discussed, the $33 trillion debt, the shifting global alliances, and the erosion of fiscal pillars are not doomsday theories. They are mathematical and historical realities, currently in motion as we move through 2026. By diversifying across different value systems, you are doing more than just protecting your money. You are protecting your freedom, your standard of living, and the legacy you have spent decades building. The situation always changes, but those who understand the cycles of history don't have to fear the future. They simply have to be ready for it.